Today is July 1st, 2014. My name is Tanya Finchum along with Alex Bishop. We're with Oklahoma State University, and today we're in Cushing, Oklahoma to speak with Marie Rainwater, and this is part of our Oklahoma 100-Year Life project. So thank you for having us today.
It's Marie.
Marie. I need to say that again. Marie Rainwater.
I thought you said Mary.
I probably did. Or my Tennessee accent's coming in there, huh? Marie Rainwater.
Right.
All right, so let's start with having you tell us when and where you were born.
I was born on a farm north of Ripley, Oklahoma on February the 21st in 1912.
During the winter. Was it stormy that day? Do you know?
It was. I'll tell you what, my father had to ride a horse 2 miles to call the doctor to come out in the country. And when he got there, there'd been big snowstorms and there was drift up our driveway. And his little horses wouldn't pull him up. He's kind of a fat fellow. And finally, my dad got him up to the porch, and they couldn't get him in off of the buggy into the porch. So finally, Dad went in and got a blanket and wrapped around him and rolled him over onto that porch. We've laughed about that years about after the doctor got there.
Well, did you have brothers and sisters?
I have a mother that's named Florence, not Cheryl, and my dad was Frank James Cheryl. And I had an older brother, George Sherrill, that was 6 years older than me. And then I was the next child. And then my next one was a boy, and he was 3 years younger than I. And then the next was a girl, and I always say that us girls were 6 years apart. And then the last child was a little boy, but he died in infancy.
Okay.
And so there were 3 boys and 3 girls of us.
Okay. And what did your parents do for a living?
Well, my dad was a farmer, and my grandfather had come down and made the run up to Glencoe, and he didn't like the one he chose. So he went down there north Ripley and found the place that he wanted. And so he bought 640 acres for $1,400. And that was in 1995. And they moved down on that farm. And grandfather was a carpenter and a bricklayer and all like that. And he built a house out there, just a little claim house, you might say. And that's where we started in as farming. And then the grandfather was cattle. He ran lots of cattle. And then Dad didn't want to fool with the cattle, so he got rid of it. And he was a wheat farmer. So we lived out there on that farm until I guess they went to town when I was a senior in high school.
And where did you go to elementary school?
I went to a little 8 rooms where they taught 8 grades all in one room, and there was about 20 of us students. And this woman was really nice. She really knew how to take care of kids. And I went there the first 2 years, and then our little school consolidated with Ripley. And they sent buses out and collected the children and took them in. And my dad took me to school the first day, and he told the teacher there, standing there listening to him, he said, now she's been in a little rural school all this time, and I don't think she's prepared to go into the 3rd grade. Said I'd like to keep her this year in the 2nd grade again. And this teacher looked at me and she said, oh no, let's let her try, and if she can make it, I'll let her go on in the 3rd grade. So that's how I started in this school. Well, it didn't take me long to prove to them that I was capable of going into the 3rd grade.
Okay. And what would you take for your lunch? Do you remember?
Oh, Lord, yes, a lunch box. And we lived on the farm where we had all kinds of fruit trees, and Mother raised turkeys and chickens and all like that. And so Mother cooked the best donuts. I can still taste them, and put in our lunches, and she had us a good lunch every day. She believed that if feeding you was showing your love for you. I never suffered for not having enough food.
Well, did you have chores on the farm?
Well, I had the chores. I was to help Mother with the other children. And to this day, the other children say that I was bossy, and they really tell me off every once in a while that I've been bossy with it. But Mother'd say, now, Marie, you take care of the children. Well, if I saw them doing something that would hurt them or something, I absolutely told them off, you quit that. And so I did take care of it. The youngest girl, I practically reared her because Mother had lost the baby before her, and she was in poor health. And so it was, Marie, you take care of the little baby, that we have now. And that was my chore. To this day, she lives over here about 6 blocks from me. And she's 90 years old. And we just talk every day on the phone 100 times.
Did you have to wash her diapers, or was that your mother's job?
No, Mother usually was there on the worst day, and it was me to hang them up and things like that.
Okay. Did she raise a big garden?
Oh, a big garden, and she also raised all these turkeys and chickens. And we had fried chicken except 1 month of the year.
And what month was that?
There's nothing wrong with it, I'll tell you.
What month did she skip?
Oh, I think it was in June.
Any particular reason why?
Oh, it was something about getting the chickens. She bought them at the nursery, and then by the time she'd get them up to the size where they were eatable, I believe it was June.
Okay. Well, after the elementary school, you went to Ripley High School, I guess?
Yes, I did. And the thing about it, they consolidated and got in a lot of other schools. And the year that I was a senior, there were only 4 of us seniors. And so that kind of put there's one big class, and then here this little class of 4. But we kind of had a good time as we went through.
Well, what year did you graduate?
19 and 30.
Depression time.
I'll say it's Depression time. We of course lived on that farm, and nobody had any clothes extra or anything like that, but everybody looked after other people. I thought this morning, I don't have a middle name, but it should have been Share, S-H-A-R-E. I never enjoyed anything if I didn't share it with somebody else. And that's the way I've been all my life. I just feel terrible to think, here I have this and I'm sitting here by myself. And I just love to share things with people.
Well, I'm glad you're sharing your story with us.
Well, now a lot of people wouldn't do it.
No, they wouldn't. Well, was church an important part of your growing up?
It was the most important part. Out in the farm, we didn't have any churches. And there was a little church up on top of a hill about 5 miles from our home. And they'd have a revival of 1 week in the summer. Well, every night we got in an old surrey, and the kids and my grandmother lived with us, as Dad's mother, and Mother and Dad, and we drove a team of horses. And I was afraid to come home at night. I'd sit up I was a daddy's girl, so I'd sit up in the seat with my father, and I'd say, Dad, now how's it come these horses know when to turn? And Dad'd say, well, now that I just pull a line to how long to go that way. And so I kept worrying about it. I was afraid someone was going to run into us. That the second night we went, Dad tied a lantern on the front of our front horse, and then I didn't worry anymore. I thought that lantern's going to save us.
That was pretty smart for your father to do that.
Well, yeah, Dad always looked out for me, because I just trailed around with him, and most of the time, and I didn't care about playing with dolls and all that. I'd rather get out and see the calves and the horses and things like that.
Do you remember if that particular horse had a name that took you to a church and back?
Well, we had one that was called Rome, and then my brother had a Palomino, a beautiful horse, it was a riding horse, and I just announced that mine left me. I don't know why.
That's okay. Is the farm still in the family?
It is. My sister owns the original farm, 80 acres. They sold off all the land to go down to 160 acres. And 180 belonged to my dad. Well, and when he died, he left us children, and then the other 80 had gone to my aunt. And so my sister then, when my father died, and then my mother died, well, she and I together bought the surface right of this 80 over here. And then later on, when I was teaching and all, my aunt was going to sell her part. She lived in California and she didn't need the land. And so I bought that. So I own the 80 here, and my sister owns the 80 here.
Okay.
And I must tell you something. They got the lease, and they're just leasing everything on Payne County and drilling. I've never seen nothing like it. It's always been oil drilling and everything. Well, we have a well on the old home place that's produced oil since 1970. But I know that a lot of times we didn't get all of our oil back. That's just a proven fact, because now it got to the point they said it only made 6 barrels a day. But now, since they sold it to another company, we got a very good sizable check out of that well this year. The 6 children still own the royalty under that, and I own all the royalty under my 80. And they've been wanting to, they first wanted to lease it, and I said, all right. And they were offering everybody else $20 an acre. And I told my grandson who lives in California that they were leasing land, and he said, now, grandmother, you're no business leasing land at your age. He says, you just let me come back there and lease it. I said, Jay, I never have had to have someone else do something for me. And so I went on and I got 22.5 acres, or 25 acres, $25 an acre for that. And that really brought in a good income with that. And so then I called my grandson and I said, well, I leased the land. And he said, well, did you just give it away? I said, no, I got the top price.
Good for Grandma.
And now they're sending out letters. I've received 12 from different oil companies wanting to buy my royalty under that 80. Well, you know, they know there's something good there. it's been a well there once, and that's what I sent my grandson to college on, was this old well pumping. And then they closed it during those Skinner, they said there's just little skimpy wells, and they shut them all down. But we've got it, and I've got the letters in there where 12 oil companies have sent me in, and one person said, well, now what do you want for that? I said, I don't want, because I do not intend to sell. And another man called, and he's kind of snippy, and he said, what if I'd offer you $1 million an acre? Would you take it? I said, no, because I don't need the money right now, and I'm going to keep that royalty. If it's worth that to you, it's worth more to me. So I've still got the old royalty and the old farm, and my sister's got the other one.
They don't mess with you, huh?
Well, I'll tell you, the thing about it is, I've always had a feeling that you've got to look out for yourself, and you got to plan ahead and things like that. And so many people wait till an emergency comes, and then they don't know what to do.
True.
And my dad always told us one thing. He said, the Lord helps those who help themselves. And this old grandmother, she was a real charger, and one day she said, I'm telling you kids one thing, if the Lord be with you, who can be against you? And you know, that has carried true, those two things, all my life. When I get in a tight, I think, well, the Lord be with you, who can be against you? And the other was that you earn what you work for. And all of us kids, and I got to think another thing, he's talking about scholarships. There wasn't a thing in my time growing up such as a scholarship. You never heard of it. So I never had any scholarships or anything like that to start my college with.
Well, speaking of that, let's back up then. You graduated from high school in 1930.
Yes.
And then what did you do?
Well, the funny thing was that my dad and mother had sent my brother off to college, and 2 weeks before he graduated from business school, he jumps up and goes off and gets married. Well, that disappointed them. They said, there we sent George to college and all, and had great expectations, and here he is, he gets up and married. Well, I came along, and I wanted to go to college, and they were going to send me to college. And I said, I'm not going to live out here on this old farm and be a farmer's wife or work like a slave in this old farm. I'm not going to do it. So I went over to town and asked the woman at the telephone office if she had anything for me to do in the way of telephone. And she said yes. She was a widow and had 3 little kids and lived in the office where the telephone was. And so she took me in and I roomed with her, and she taught me how to operate the telephone switchboard. And I went to college. I didn't think I was going to college, so one night my mother called me, and well, it was one morning, and she said, what are you doing? I said, I'm sitting here at the switchboard watching the kids go to school. And I said, Mother, how I wish I could go to school. So in a little bit she called me back and said, could you come out and eat supper with your dad and I tonight? And I said, yes. So we hadn't got, I bet, 5 miles out of town. So my dad said, we've decided to send you to school if you really want to go. And so they sent me to Central Steeds because I'd had an application in to be a nurse at St. Francis. And Dad didn't think that the nurses was supervised enough, and he wouldn't let me go. And so then when I went to work for the telephone office, see, I was on my own. And so when I went to school, I went in a tin suitcase where my clothes was all I had to go down to college. I didn't have a lot of clothes. We was in that depression. And I went down there, and my dad found a place that I could room and board with some people he knew. So they paid for my room and board a month and put me in down there. And I was in a house with 14 other girls, and most of them were juniors and seniors. And I was glad I got in with those kids, because they took me up the next morning to enroll, and they knew who were the hard professors and who were the easy ones, and they got me all enrolled. And I was real happy with going to school with all those older girls. And then one day I got so lonesome for the family. I was homesick, and I decided I was going to quit school and go home. So I got my clothes out and put in this little suitcase, and sitting on the bed, and one of the senior girls came home, and she saw me and said, "What are you doing, Marie?" I said, "I packed up, I'm going home." "Why," she says, "my land, you don't want to do that." So she came in and gave me a good talking to and said, "If you go home, then your family won't send any of the other kids to school, because you and your brothers both been a failure." Well, I rolled that over in my mind a couple of times, and I thought, I don't want to have to be a stumbling block for the rest of them. So I pulled my clothes out and hung them up. That's the last time I decided to quit school.
Oh, what was your major?
Well, at first, I took just elementary education, because I wanted to get a teaching certificate so I could get out and start making money myself. And so I got for 1 year, I got a 2-year teaching certificate to teach 1 to 8 grades. Now, before that, you could go, and if you're a high school graduate, and you could take a test, and if you passed it, they give you a certificate to teach 1 year. And several of my friends did that, but I didn't. So then I started I'd take Saturday classes over at OSU, or I'd take an extension course. I worked all the time trying to get, and finally I got a bachelor's degree from Central State. And I wasn't contented with that. And I wound up I had these little second graders. I got so I talked like one. Well, you have to communicate with them.
True.
And I thought I acted like a second grader. And I said, I'm going to get out of this. So I went in teaching business subjects. And I got my first degree in elementary, and the second degree was in secondary with a major in business subjects. So then I got the job of teaching shorthand and bookkeeping and typing and all like that. And I taught there for 19 years, 2 years in elementary and the rest of them in this high school. Well, I, of course, then got married, and I got dissatisfied with the school. They just fired one teacher after another, never threatened me, but I was always sympathetic with the one they did. And finally, I told my husband, I said, I'm going to get out of here. So I applied over here at Cushing, and by golly, they hired me to be the business teacher and the financial secretary. And of course, I came over here and everything was new and such a big school. And when those lockers began to cling and cling, I thought, what have I gotten into? But everybody was just as nice as they could be to me. And so I taught 19 years here. And I finally told them I wasn't going to keep that financial secretary. That was just a headache. They just come in and want to check, and then they'd want deposit money, and I couldn't get any satisfaction out of them. And finally then I told them I wouldn't teach that, so they gave me, I wanted the high school counseling, and that's what I took my master's in. And so when I got my master's, then I became the high school counselor for 9 years here. And that's what I really loved.
Well, was that from OSU?
Yes.
Your master's. Do you remember what year that was that you got that?
Oh, gosh. That It was in well, why it's so hard for me to remember that is because I went on the National Board of Rural Carriers Auxiliary.
Rural carriers?
Rural carriers, and there was 22,000 women belonged when I was in there, and I was on that board 5 years. And I taught, and I'd go in here to Mr. Carr, the superintendent, and I'd say, Mr. Carr, I'm going to have to be off now for a couple of days. And he'd look at me and say, well, get a substitute. And that's all and I've thought lots of times. Imagine me going into the superintendent and say, I'm going to be gone for a couple of days. But he seemed to enjoy it, promote me.
Well, how did you get involved with the rural mail carriers?
Well, that is really a story. My husband, when I married him, he was a pharmacist. And he was a pharmacist down in Spire, Oklahoma. And I met him on vacation. And we went together, over the phone for about 2 years. And then finally we got married. And he was then working here in a drugstore in Cushing. And so I told him, I said, that's a terrible thing. And he went to war and was gone 38 months. Back and forth, he'd come once in a great while. He'd have a furlough. And so then this woman at the post office, I kept choking. I went in there practically every morning to mail Ryle a letter. And I said, I want your job, because she was a former teacher, and she just sat at that window and gave out mail. And so jolly and everything. I said, I want that job when you retire. Well, when she retired, she called me and she said, now, Marie, I'm going to retire and I can send your application in with mine, and I know I can get it for you. Well, I said, let me think of it tonight. So I went home and told Ryle, because he'd come back with a frozen foot and leg, got behind the lines. And I said, now there's your chance to go in as a rural carrier later, because that man that was going to retire as a rural carrier. And so, sure enough, I went back next morning and I said, Ms. Shoup, I don't want that job. But I said, Ryle would like to change job because of his injury to his foot. Oh, she said, I'd as soon him have it as you. So he got the assistant postmaster to begin with. And he is always the kind, he took an active part in whatever he belonged to. And he got to go, and he was elected on their state board. And I got to go on, and I enjoyed it, because most of the women were well educated, secretaries and things like that, for that time. And so next thing you know, I was going with them, and it's such a nice crowd, and I enjoyed it. And Ryle went on and was state president, and then here I came on behind him as the auxiliary president. And that was one of the most enjoyable things I ever did, because when I was president, I had a thyroid operation. It was cancer, and they had nominated me for the board, and somebody got that and said, well, she'll not live long enough to finish that. Well, the next year I ran again, and I got it. And my national convention was in Statler Hilton Hotel in Boston. And the main speaker was a man that had so much to do with diabetes. And of course, I took for my money raising cancer research, and I took for my, I don't know what you call it, but anyhow, whatever it is that they take for some kind of a deal that they work. Mine was to see that every child that was a rural carrier's child was tested for diabetes, because they said that so many children had it that didn't know it. And we tested, and I bet you that 90% of those children we tested had diabetes.
Mhm.
And I thought, well, that was the one good deed that was done, was to get those children all in and get them tested for diabetes.
Mm.
And so that's how I got off on the rural carriers. And then Rob was elected to the national board, and he went on through, and the year he went off, I was elected to the National Women's Board. And when he was in, we had to go live in Washington, D.C. We lived up there 5 years. And of course, I was history. I love history. And I just hunted up everything. I belonged to DAR and all that, and proved my history way back when. And so then, while we were up there, of course, I just went to see everything I could, and I kept a grandson every summer for 5 summers. And all we did was get around and go to the museums and the libraries and what have you. And I think that boy made a good student out of him because he traveled with us. I know I got off the subject. But
No, that's fine. I was just trying to, how did that fit into being a school teacher? Was this after you had retired from teaching, or was it during?
oh, it's during the
During?
school. How in the world did I could keep on the national board for 5 years and get and go? In the summer, I had 5 state conventions I had to visit.
I don't know. How did you do it?
I don't know sometimes now. I think that maybe is why I'm so worn out. But really, that was just, I had to get everything in place.
A good time manager.
And Rod and I enjoyed this travel. Gosh, we loved to travel together. So I got off on the rural carriers.
Well, did he actually ever deliver the mail?
Oh, Lord, he did. He went out in the country. He had a 100-mile route.
Oh.
And he delivered those papers, see, to everybody out on the mailboxes. And when it's bad weather, boy, he really hated it because it was terrible to deliver the mail. It was raining, muddy roads, and you get stuck and everything else happened to you. But I did. I managed it. I had help at home to clean the house and things like that. And then I had everything that was just so.
Well, when you moved from Ripley to Cushing, or did you still live in Cushing and drive back and forth? I mean, live in Ripley and drive back and forth?
We had a nice home in Ripley. And so we came over here and rented an apartment. And we'd come over here and stay all week and then go back over there. We had Rita, our only daughter, was with us. And then we'd go back over there. Well, we hated to sell our home over there, and we intended to really make it a place really nice. And finally we decided, well, why not sell it? And then we bought a home over here and moved over here, and we've been here since. We went to Edmond after we came back from civil service in D.C. and went to Edmond or Oklahoma City and lived 3 years down there. And I didn't like it. Everywhere you had to go, it was crowded and everything. And so we came back. My mother's getting old, and I talked to Riley. He wanted to go to Stillwater. That's where he wanted to go. But I talked him out of it because Mother lived here. And we built this house here rather than build in Stillwater.
And that was about what year? Do you remember?
Let's see now, when was that? My gosh. We came back from there in 1970. And we lived 3 years in Oklahoma City. And we came back here in 80-something, built this house.
Okay. What was Ripley like when you were a youngster? The town itself?
Oh my gosh, it was a little you could walk all over it. And but that is the thing that got me started right. There's a little Church of God over on the corner, right across from our house. In those days, Mother wasn't a bit afraid to let me go any night over there at that church. And I've always been a person that seeks knowledge. I want to know what's going on. And also I'd go there, and I was only 11 and 12-year-old child, and I'd sit and listen to those mostly old gray-haired people on prayer meeting nights, and they'd get up and testify what the Lord had done for them and all, and I'd sit there and listen to that night after night. Now sometimes I'd think to myself, well now, has that really happened to them? Or are they just telling that to make themselves look really big in the church that they go to? And at that time, that church didn't believe in doctrine. And we saw many a funeral of a woman that had died in childbirth. And so one night they had a revival and I went. And I don't know why, but before I knew it, I was crying, and I went up to the altar. And this gray-haired lady that I'd known all my life, she came there and she prayed for me and all, and she said, now Marie, you'll be a better person. And I thought of that. So then they came over next day and wanted me to join the church. So he put in my membership. And I said, I can't do it. And she wanted to know why. And I said, because I can't be a hypocrite. I said, I believe in doctrine, and I'm going to doctor. And here I've been telling people that I belong to this church. I said, it just don't make sense. So I never would join that church, on their book work. But that is where I made up that night, and then the next week or two following, I made certain resolutions that I was going to live by the rest of my life. And nobody helped me make them up. One was I wouldn't drink. Another was that I wasn't going to ever lie. Well, that was something unheard of in my family. My dad would have beat me to death if I'd lied to him. And things like that. And it's that little church. And I was 12 years old that I made these resolutions to myself. Well, then after I got married, my husband, we were up there, we went to cocktail parties and all, and the other two women that were in there, they're farm people too, they're just like me. Well, they got so they'd have a cocktail all going around and I wouldn't. Well, they decided that they was going to break me down and they was going to teach me to drink. So the national secretary was sitting baby one night and he said, now Marie, I'm going to order you a cocktail that you'll just love. And he ordered it, and I just let it sit there and deteriorate right in front of it. And one time they got me in a convention, and we were having to meet. The women were in a bar, and it's up in Maine. And so they called me up to the bar and gave me a Coke, and then took a picture, and then they said, now we can show people that Mrs. Rainwater was drinking. I said, well, my enemies will love that. But I said, my people that are friends will know better than that. So just show the picture all you want to. But it's just something like that. I just went from one thing to another. I was always trying to raise up a step up higher or doing something different. I didn't want to stay in the teaching profession until I just got so old they threw me out. And I'd take on these new challenges.
Well, had someone in your life been doing that too, and you were mentored, or anyone you looked up to that did that?
That was the funny part of it. My mother she never was a president of anything. Every time I joined the organization, I somewhere or other filtered to the top and became the president of the organization. I belonged to the ARs and the Eastern Star, and there were White Shrine and I don't know, whatever, all the PTAs and OEA and NEA, and I have 50-year pins from the Rural Carriage Auxiliary, and I have 50-year pin for my church, and that takes a lot of going.
It takes a lot. Well, what was Cushing like back in those early days?
Well, it was an old boom town, and it didn't lack for excitement here. It was a new town, and the oil was just a-flowing. Nobody had any hard luck over here at that time. It was really a thriving town. And it went kind of on a slump, and now it's coming back. Here we got this tank farm out here. See, it's the world's largest tank farm. And those big truckers that are bringing in oil here, they come in the morning, they're just like chicken coming in here. And they're off the load, and then they're going back in the evening. And we've counted them one time. I counted them going to Stillwater, and we counted going and coming. We counted 30 of those big tankers. So Cushing really hasn't suffered at all for this downplay. Now it's a hard time to try to find a place to buy here. And this pasture across from us here, they're starting out to survey the streets. They're going to make that into a new addition over there, all that whole block. And I don't know. We had some here. This was all an elderly group here when we came out here. And the other night they broke in a house just 3 doors down and robbed it, just stripped it. The man was gone. And then came up here to the driveway of this car next door, and they broke into it and stripped it. So it's getting to be we're just worried all the time because we have dope. That's what Cushing's having to fight now.
Changed a lot then, and
Yeah, it does.
I understand your father was musical.
Oh, Lord, that's a story all by itself. Do you want to hear it?
I do.
Well, I'll tell you what. Dad was an old-time fiddler, and he had a beautiful violin, and he drank some, and he'd play for dances, and my mother was bitterly opposed to it. And they got Dad in trouble over it, so Dad sold his violin and gave it up, told Mother he wouldn't drink anymore and all, and so everything quieted down. And so then we moved to Ripley, and Dad took a job with an oil company, and we were doing real well. We leased the old farm for $75 an acre. All we left the farmhouse with was just our clothes and our bedding. And we bought all new furniture and everything for the house in Ripley. Well, one night Dad worked tower work. He'd work 12 hours and then go back and sleep for 12 hours or have it rest. And so they'd go down to this old barber shop there in town. And one night a man brought a violin in. Dad says, "Let me see that." And he whipped off a tin, and they just thought it was wonderful. Play another. And so he did. So every night they'd go down there in that barber shop, and one man ran back and got his banjo, and another got a mandolin, and another got a guitar. And first you know, they had a little band going. Well, at that time, they just opened up KFRU down here at Bristol. Her first radio is here in Oklahoma. And so what they'd do, they'd give you an hour's time if you come there and play a musical thing so that they could advertise this new radio station. So Dad and the man got in the car and went down to Bristol and talked to them, and they got an hour to play to advertise that. So they were the first cowboy band to play on the airwaves. And we got that all recorded. I've had a real battle with some of them that wanted to cheat Dad out of that glory. And I said, you're not going to do it. Because I got that. And so finally we got in such a row there in Ripley, that, and I was over here then, that they sent one of their chief newsmen from Oklahoma City, the Oklahoman, up here, and he investigated all of it, and he wrote a big article in the Oklahoman and said the only thing that Mrs. Rainwater had ever quoted that wasn't right was the fact that I called the first band the Frank Sherrill's Cowboy Band. And he says, the best I can research it, it was called the Old Time Fiddlers. Now that's all he could find was wrong of mine. And the rest of them, my dad quit them because they wanted him to go to New York and play at the Square Gardens. And he and these men all had jobs, and they couldn't go off and leave their family up there. And then a bunch of just kids got one. They called it then the Cowboy Band, Billy McGinnis Cowboy Band. They went off playing. And Dad and the old original Cowboy Band went down there and said they're shysters. And they had quite a time now. They said they had a big lawsuit over that. Someone taking up their name, going out to play. I know I'm talking too much.
No, you're doing fine. How had he learned how to play the fiddle?
No, I played the piano, and my mother played the guitar, and one brother played the bass fiddle. And among us kids, and my dad and mother, we had a band of our own, and we still lived across from this little church. And Mother wouldn't let Dad play while they had any kind of church services over there. But as soon as the church was over, Dad would strike up the band. Here are these people. We had a double porch on one side of the house. I mean, it was out here in front of the bedroom, and a big porch in front of the living room. And those people, in all of them, I think, could come over there and sit on those porches and listen to my dad play till it'd be all 11 o'clock, and my mother'd get up and say, now, you gonna quit playing? You know you got to work tomorrow. And so she'd make him quit playing, and then they'd all leave. But it was something, I mean, it filled your soul with music. I mean, I loved that old Bob Wells when he started up, see? That's the same kind of music my dad had played. And I just loved that old music.
Well, how did he learn how to play the fiddle?
Well, his father was known in the old times. They learned everything by ear. I don't know how they did it, but my grandfather said that he is one of the best old fiddlers that's in the country. And he played, and these boys, he had two of them, and they played, see, just from memory. And Dad could sit and listen to a tune, a new one, and he could just fiddle in a minute and have that tune, and boy, off he'd go. And these people had learned the guitar and things like that. Just, it hadn't been, some of them had lessons and all, and Dad told me that he'd get me a piano if he got a series of wet. That's where the well was blowing out, and they had to wear slickers and all, and they paid him well for that, shutting the well in. And he said, if I make a month money this month, I'll buy you a new piano, which he did. And so then I started taking lessons, and gosh, here's little kids, little tykes, sit down and play, and here I was just starting, and I wouldn't take any lessons, so I just learned from that few I had. I just kind of taught myself. But I tell you, our house was nothing but a place of music.
Well, did they dance too, or was it just
Lord,
music?
we had dances in homes then, and then Dad and this band went off to Ponca City and Guthrie and places like that and played for these big hall dances. And I know I went with them one time, and a lot of times this woman that was a pianist, she was a concert pianist. She was here recuperating from some illness that she had with her father. And she played with those old boys all that time. And she gave lessons besides. And so that's where I got my start. And do you know that I later, two little girls that lived out in the country when I went back to live with my folks during the war, these little girls wanted to take lessons and they had nobody around to do it. And they wanted to know if I could just teach them how to start out. And I did. I taught those two girls all summer, 2 summers. And by golly, one of them ended up here at OSU, the accompanist for the choral group and all those kinds of things. Yeah, I paid my dues there on that.
You had your fingers in a lot of things, sounds like.
Oh, heck, yes. My sister gets after me now because you can see all these scrapbooks that I've got in here. I love to make scrapbooks, and I love history. And I've done a family history of 5 generations on my mother and father's side on down. And I've just happened to be lucky enough that I saved my grandmother's big old trunk full of old-time pictures of the family, and I put in the pictures and all that, and I found one of my old third cousin down here in Texas, and her grandmother and my grandmother were my grandmothers were sisters, and she's down in Texas, and here we found each other, and I happened to have a picture of her grandmother. And so I sent it to her, and was she ever pleased with it?
Well, did any of them live to be 100? Your grandparents and parents lived to be 100?
My mother's mother lived to be 92, just like 2 days ahead, 92. And that's what I kept aiming for. I wanted to be the one that would have more years to my life than that. And sure enough, I have. Now, I've already passed 6 months in the 3rd year. So when it goes over to February, I'll have 103.
So what are you aiming for now?
What?
What are you aiming for now?
Well, I first aimed for 105. And now, since I'm doing so well, I say, why not put it out to 110?
Why not?
Did you ever think you'd live to be 100?
What?
Did you ever think
No,
that you...
sure, I never did, but I kept wanting to because that grandmother was so braggy about it that she lived so long. And I wanted to show the family that there's someone else that can live long too.
A little bit competitiveness in.
Yeah, oh, it is. But the dress roll, I can remember those old dust storms. And the poor little kids I taught, I had 30-some little 2nd graders, and they'd come to school without any shoes on their feet hardly. They'd put pasteboard in under their feet to keep them off the ground. And a lot of them came to school and didn't have any school lunch, but their folks wanted them to go get an education. And the woman was teaching the 3rd grade. One day I was sitting talking to her, and she finished her sandwich, a half, and she threw the other half in the wastebasket. And I knew there were 2 little boys sitting out under the window that hadn't had anything to eat. It was her room. So I just picked the sandwich up and went out and leaned over in the window, and I said, boys, have this. And I came back and she said, now, Marie Rainwater, you don't need to think I'm going to start feeding my kids like you do yours. And I just thought, girl, you want to receive the rewards I do for being nice and kind to these kids. And now I have some of those people that I taught. I've got a second grader living right across the road from me that's just so good to go with me and help me when we go out on a trip or something. And I've got, there's 6 of them, and I'm going to have them for a luncheon this summer. But those 6 are still living. They're all up in their 70s, and some of them may be 80. But I just always did it. And see, we lived on a farm, and I'd get up in the morning, I'd tell Mother and Dad about how pitiful these children were about not having things. And Mother'd take a big old brown bag, and if we had had fried chicken the night before, what was left over, she'd fix it and put it in there. And we always had apples and pears and things like that, and she'd fill that old sack up. And so then I'd tell these kids, now come up here if you don't have anything, and we'll have a picnic. And they'd get up around my desk, and I'd feed them at noon. And finally, one time, I sent a note to some mothers that I knew were well-to-do enough that they could afford to send the cookies or something, and said we was going out to the bowl dime to have a picnic on Friday afternoon. Well, come Friday morning, it's raining, and so noon we couldn't go. So I told the kids, I said, just gather around my desk and we'll have a picnic, bring what you have or anything. And when we got all ready to eat, I looked back and there's 3, a little boy and 2 girls. And this little boy was Tom Berry's relative of some kind. He was one of the Berries. And his mother had sent us a cake, a whole cake. And he had that cake in front of him, and these 2 little girls, one had fried chicken and another one had something else. And I said, aren't you coming up here to join the picnic? Harry said, no, we're going to eat our stuff here. And I said, well, you better come up here and eat with us. I said, your mother sent that to share. And they weren't going to do it. I said, all right. So all during our meal, I kept thinking, what can I do to teach those 3 kids a lesson? So when we were almost through eating, I gave the money to a little boy, and I said, you go down to the drugstore, and I counted how many I had, and get popsicles, because the kids all loved that. And so he went down and got this sack of popsicles, and he came back, and I started handing them out. And Harry and Louise and this other little girl ran up, to the desk to get theirs. And I ran out when I got to them. And Harry said, why, won't you give me one? I said, no, you didn't go on the picnic with us, so I didn't order one for you. And he just cried. And I'll bet you those kids never forgot that. I just taught them a lesson right there, to show them that if you don't share with other people, well, then you don't expect to be shared with.
I'm surprised they let you send a kid out of the school to town to get the popsicles.
No, in those days, you were head of that classroom. You can do anything. You took care of them yourself.
That was during the 40s, during the war.
Well, that was it. I started teaching in 32, so this had to be in 32 through 34, somewhere in that.
Before you got married.
What were the war days like? Did your husband serve, or?
Yes, he served he was a pharmacist, and he went in the 43rd General Hospital. And it was awful. You saw so much suffering of people, and everybody's getting a dear letter about somebody that was missing in action or killed in action and everything. And I was pregnant when he went in at the end of his service over here in the United States. And so I went back out to the farm with my dad and mother, and I stayed with them, and I quit teaching during that time, and Loretta was born, and she didn't see her dad till she was like 2 days of being 2 years old. And you can't imagine what it was like. I was worried all the time about him, and I went over to Stillwater and had Loretta there at the Stillwater Hospital, and my brother lived there in Stillwater, and they wouldn't let me go home unless I'd go in an ambulance. I'd had such a time. And I kept me 11 days in the hospital. And Loretta and I went home, and somebody brought us in the flu. They wanted to see the baby, and they didn't care if they had the flu. They came to see her. I could have shot them if I'd known who it was. Just imagine, in wartime, we didn't have any electricity, we didn't have any water out there on the farm. And one morning, the cows got out, and there's men working down on this well that's on there now. And I told Mother said, well, they've got to get in because they'll just scatter all over the country. So I told her I'd get in the car and go down and just drive. It was frozen, the ground was. So I got out and I was trying to herd those cattle and get them by honking the horn and all, and these oil field workers saw me. And they came over and said, you go back up to the house, said, we'll get these cattle in for you. People in those days, they would help you in most anything. And another thing, these scholarships didn't start for kids in college.
Right.
I never heard of a scholarship, see. You either had to get it on your own or you didn't get it. But thank God we had OSU. I knew it when it was A&M. And see, I took mine in all my electives in history and economics. And so when I got ready to graduate down at Central State, I went there to graduate because that's where I had most of my hours. And they called me that morning, told me to come in to the fellow that goes over, checks all this. And I went in, I just shivered, and I thought, gosh, I haven't done something, I won't graduate. And that was the year that they were letting them get so many graduate. We had 400 and some kids graduating that summer. And I'm kind of lost my thought now during.
They were checking to see if you'd.
Oh yeah, and I got up there and they came out and made had a major to teach history and government. Didn't even know I had it. I just took those because I was always interested and I was good in it. And I could make a good grade, so I always took that. But then I never did. They wouldn't ever let me teach history over here at Cushing because I went in and I wanted to take the man's place that was quitting, and he's head of the history department. And I looked at this principal, he and I was always good friends, and I said, and why don't you want me to be over the history department? He said, because you're too opinionated. And I was. I've been an old redneck Democrat all my life because I look at it the way I've looked at it, that everything like rural electrification, Social Security, all those things has been brought about by a Democrat Congress or the president was a good Democrat. And I feel like right now that if we haven't had a joker out, we've had a Congress up there that has not done anything all winter long. They've not passed a job bill. And why they won't want people that are out of work to have a job and things like that, I just can't understand it.
How do you keep up with that sort of thing? Newspaper, TV, how do you keep up?
That's something I want to share with you, is that I always read the newspaper, the Ripley paper when it isn't going, and the Cushing paper and the Stillwater paper. I never miss one of the Stillwater papers. I read about all your library things and all, and wish I lived there so I could go to some of them. But you take this. I've kind of lost the thought then. What was I?
How you're keeping up with current events?
Oh yeah, I keep up with those, and now I lost the sight in this eye. I went in for a cataract surgery, and the old doctor just brought it on my eye, and I started crying. I said, well, let me up. I can't stand any more of this. And so he raised me up, and he said, well, Mrs. Rainwater, he said, I couldn't get that cataract, but you have lost the sight in that eye. And here I've been such a person to read all this time. And so he went out and told my husband that I was hemorrhaging and get me to Dean McGee just as soon as he could to save the eyeball. So we went to Dean McGee, and I had to go 5 different Saturdays down there to have that eye treated. Well, then I was blind, and that's when I gave up driving a car and a lot of things, because the family thought it wasn't best for me to drive with blindness in one eye. And it went on 2 years, and I said one day, watch the television. I watch television every minute I can. And I thought I saw a little glimmer of light in that eye. So I made an appointment to see Dr. Drummond. And he examined why. He said, Miss Rainwater, I can operate and put a little deal in this electric thing. And he said, you'll have perfect vision. So I said, well, all right. So I went in for that. And as soon as he took that off cataract, oh, I could just see it was wonderful. And then all at once there was a little black ball that just started rolling in over my sight. And I called Dr. Drummond, and he said, oh, it's a hemorrhage, just like the I did on you before. Well, I had to go down to there, and I went in, and the man that had operated on me for this to save the eyeball, he told me specifically when he discharged me, don't you let anybody work on that eye. You're blind, and you just got to accept it. Well, here I go in, and he recognized me. He said, I thought I told you not to do this. And I said, well, I had a chance to get, and I took it, and my chance wasn't good this time. But they doctored and saved that eye, and that was back in the, oh, Lord, it's been about 10, 12 years now I've had good sight. And now I've started losing both sides. I mean, I've still got this old cataract, and I can see out of this cataract eye almost as well as I can see out of this one. And so Dr. Drummond keeps wanting me to come in and have this and operate on. But I reason that if I do, and this happens to be that, have that blood clot on it, well then what if I'm blind in both eyes? And I'd better keep some kind of a sight. But I'm so disappointed. I got my Stillwater paper this morning, and I can't read only just the big headlines. And now that really's cut down. But then I turn on TV, and I have certain stations that I watch, and I'm busy all day long doing something.
What's a typical day like for you? What time do you get up, and what do you do? And
well, now today I got up at 4 o'clock. I couldn't sleep. I just woke up all at once, wall-eyed. And in the night, this is a funny thing to tell you, I sleep under a big wool blanket of a thing, and I couldn't get comfortable. I was cold. I was just freezing. And finally I got up and looked down, and my covers had got off to the waist, and all this was just froze solid. I felt like, and the other waist had a 3-point heat on it. And so I covered them up, and then I went back to sleep, and I slept till 4 o'clock. And I woke up just as clear as a bell. And I lay there for a while, and I thought something came back to mind that happened 70 years ago that I had forgotten all about. And I went back through that whole thing and lay there. Then I got up at 5 o'clock. It must have been about 5:30. And I always take my thyroid and my Lasix I always insist on getting it before 6 o'clock. And then at 7 I have my meal, and it's funny, I'm on that diet where you can't have any wheat germ. And I nearly starved to death. I lost 20 pounds on that when they first put me on that. I had diarrhea till it was terrible. And every time I get the least bit of flour in things, do you know, in restaurants, some of them put flour in their mashed potatoes. Why, my gosh, I got the world's wildest bunch of sores done all on that, getting that flour in the potatoes. And if it just smears over where that wheat germ's be, I'm allergic to it to that point. Well, then I get up and take my thyroid, and I have to wait an hour. And then Loretta usually gets up and she'll say, Mother, what do you want for breakfast? Well, it's a hard thing to do because there's so few things I can't eat. But I love old peanut butter. So I said peanut butter and a banana, and then I've been eating figs and dates. And sometimes I have a roll, or we found that now these waffles, just a small waffle like that. And I'll eat that. And it's kind of hard to find anything to eat, but I do that. And I wonder sometimes if I won't turn into something that's a peanut butter. Well, I just eat big spoonfuls of it.
Do you watch a lot of TV during the day, or?
I turn on that TV sometimes at 8 o'clock, and it don't go off till I'm ready to go to bed.
What's it on usually?
What?
I assume you're watching the news.
I do. I watch that news, boy. And do you know what? One of my girls that I taught here in Cushing High School, she started writing a book on my life, and then she got a third of it done, and she decided to turn in and write as if my family were a bunch of old cowboys and outlaws and everything else. And I said, you're not going to write that way. That wasn't a true fact on my family. And so she kind of got miffed at me and all. And she's a widow, and I told my daughter there's something wrong with her. There really is. The last time I talked to her, she's so radical. By golly, she's on the internet this morning and said that what they ought to do was those old fellows, those cowmen up there that run their herds out on the pastures the government land for 3 years, never paid a bit of pay for them. Well, she said they ought to get them because they're threatening out to having an uprising. And Texas down here is wanting to pull away from the government. Honestly, we're in bad times and people don't realize it. But anyhow, she put on the internet that she wanted them to come down here on the 4th of July to the town between California and Mexico. Now, I've been over there several times, but I can't remember its name right now. But anyhow, she wanted them to come down there and close the border on Mexico and us. Just run us out down there. Well, don't you know when you bring those radicals down here and they're carrying their guns and the cowboy hats and all, why Mexico is going to fight back, and we'll be in a war. You just watch. That's what they're wetting up to do. They want to destroy this government, and people are sitting around doing their daily things, and they're not listening to the news. Last night, President Obama came out and he talked about he was doing some executive orders that he's rightfully to do to try to get some of this stuff moving for Congress. And we're not getting anything done. Now they're trying to whittle off Social Security. They want to do away with giving so much money to Medicare for children. Can you imagine a poor little sick child and being refused Medicare? Mm-hmm. I can't. There's something wrong with a nation that's like that. There's just got to be.
So you're on the internet?
My daughter is, well, my grandson, she has a big computer, and so she's real good at that, and she'll tell me little tidbits that she gets. And then my grandson brought home a Apple B1 or 2 or something and gave me, and he said, now Mother can show you how to use that. And I have taught myself a great deal about it, and I sit and I've got so I drop it every once in a while, but I can't help it. It just gets away from me.
So what time do you go to bed?
Well, now, here of late, I've been so tired before 9:30 comes, and we've got some shows we especially watch at 9 and things like that. I always watch Lawrence Welk on Saturday night and Sunday night. I don't care if it is a rerun. And last night he really had a program as someone way back in the early years that is really good. But I worry about the condition of our country. I really do. And I've always taken a part in the active Democrat Party. I've been a delegate to the state convention, and I've served as officers in the Democratic Party here in Payne County. I used to be real active, and all, but now I can't go because I go in a wheelchair. And we do have a little transportation car, and Loretta puts me in the car out here. I go out in this wheelchair, and I can lift myself up and get in the car. And then when we get somewhere, Loretta has this little light, it's 25 pounds. Car doesn't have any feet rests on it, and she'll wheel me into the restaurant. And I've got a pillow in it where it's just the right height. They can push me up to a table, and I can sit there and eat peace and happiness. And then she brings me out, and I can lift myself up and get myself in the car. And then she comes along and puts that back in the boot, and we have it for another round. But we've been going to Stillwater 3 and 4 times a week to eat. We found out they have a good plate for me at the Red Lobster, and then I go over to Chili's, and they've got one good plate there. They have a hamburger, but then they told about this mad cow disease. I won't eat any more hamburgers over there. And then we used to go to Red Lobster, and they fired the proprietor, and he was a dandy. We got acquainted with him, and he'd come in and sit at the table with us and talk to us while we were eating. And they fired him and put in a woman I don't think she knows beans. So one day Loretta and I go over there, and we decided, I said, I don't care how much it costs, I'm going to have a lobster tail today. Loretta said, well, I don't blame you, Mother. So I ordered one, and they brought it out, and when I stuck my knife in the back to try to cut it, it was still frozen. So I called the waitress, and I told her that. She said, well, I'll see if you have one. And right there, and she went back in the kitchen and left me sitting there with that frozen lobster, and brings out another one, and it's frozen when I tried to cut it. So I said, well, really, let's just go. And I called the girl and I told her, I said, we want to pay this bill. She said, oh no, you'll have a free meal. I said, I didn't come in here to get a free meal. I came in here to get a meal. And I said, I can't eat a frozen lobster. And so we got up and laid the money on the desk as we went out, and we've never been back. Mm. But it's awful. And then like I went to this other, and there they were serving mashed potatoes with flour in it. And I inquired why. And they said, well, flour is much cheaper than potatoes. Mm. So you don't know what you're eating when you eat out.
That's true.
Well, I've talked enough.
No, just one or two more. What do you have a philosophy of life?
Do I have a philosophy?
Uh-huh.
Well, sure, I think that this morning, one thing about it, I never was happy if I had something, if I wasn't sharing it with somebody else. And that's been, I never had thought of that before. But I know when I was in college, these poor little girls, some of them came up there and was working in an office, and they was nearly starving to death. And I'd come home, and Mother made mincemeat pie filling out of, we'd butcher and all that, and she'd have all this fruit and everything. And when I got ready to go back to school, she'd give me maybe a half a gallon jar full of that stuff. Well, and she gave me some whipping cream. And those girls were all waiting for me when I get there. And now I could put it in the refrigerator and I could have saved it for myself. But I wouldn't have been happy knowing that those other girls didn't have anything to eat much. And we'd get around the table and sit there and laugh and eat that pie, the raisin and all from raisin pie, and we'd eat every darn bit of that one night. And that philosophy that I got from my grandmother and my dad and from the church, I've had an accumulation of good things taught to me up through the ages.
Well, do you have any advice to someone who wants to live to 100?
Well, I say live a good, clean life. And to me that is the key to all of it. Is just to live a good, clean life and do all you can for other people.
Well, what's your secret to longevity?
Well, one thing, I had a good father and mother, and we evidently had good genes. And then they fed us well and saw that we had exercise. We rode horses. I rode bucking calves, horses, and everything like that. We had all kind of activity, and we had good food. And my dad and mother saw to it that we were well educated, all of us, and all like that. And I still say you've got to have good parents, and then other people that you come in contact with. I ran into a lady here that I took her every time she had to go. She's a widow and much older than me, and I took her to White Shrine. Whenever it met, I took her there always with me. And I used to say that it don't take any more gasoline to haul 5 people than it does to haul 1. And I know some friends that never invite anybody to go anywhere they live in the car. You're selfish or something. I don't understand it. And so I just say that people, so many of them have tried to get me to break my vows that I made to myself, and I will not do it. And I'm glad that I've lived to the end with some of my standards.
Sure. Well, what brings you joy today?
Well,
What brings you joy, happiness today?
well, just seeing other people develop and become good citizens and getting themselves educated. I had the counseling group up here, and I got them in one day. I was a real good friend of the state supervisor of getting these scholarships for them if they couldn't hear or if they couldn't see or walk or something. And I pulled that whole senior class, there's 130 of them, into the auditorium, and I told them what all these were available and how you could make your apply for scholarships like the American Legion and DMLA and all that. And out of that 130, I think it was, there were 45 of them applied for scholarships and got some assistance to go to school. And the girl that operated on me for my breast cancer was a daughter of a physician that had been my physician. And she did a marvelous job. I tell you, I've never had a bit of trouble with that. And to think here she was, a kid in high school, when I knew her, and she was the nicest. She always wanted to help people. And she's retired now. If I had anything wrong with me, I'd want to talk her out of retirement.
Now, when history is written, what do you want it to say about you?
I always tried to help people get a better education or to help improve their life. And I have. All my life, I've picked up kids that everybody else said they didn't amount to anything, you know, kind of way left. And yet they're some of the brightest and most helpful when you get through that crusty curse of theirs. You find they're just as nice as they can be. But they've got to have someone that'll believe in them. I think that book on it takes the whole village to rear a child. And I think that's a lot true. Right here's an example. Over here, this girl is a widow, or I don't know, maybe a divorcee, and she's got 2 little boys. And there's another little boy comes over there. She saw him out with little BBs, and she's scared to death that they're going to shoot out one of her windows. Well, I never gave that a thought. And so the other day, those little fellas, she watches them like a hawk, you know, that they don't get over on her property. And yet she's just the best person in the world to know, but she doesn't know how to go with children. And the other day I saw them, they got their mother works, she's a pharmacist at one of the drugstores there in Stillwater. But they went in and got a hammock, and they got out between those big trees, and I watched them. And the 2 big boys said, "This little boy, you're too short now, you get out of here. You're going to hold it down in the middle." And so he got out, and they got one thing fastened, and that wind was a-blowing a hurricane gale. And that little fella, they told him, "Get in there and hold that down so we can keep it still, we get this other that." And then a big gust of wind came and blew the hammock, and that little fell off his feet way up in the air, and he hollered, "Let me down, let me down." And they had to take that and loose, and they worked a long time, but they finally got it in. And then the 3 of them climbed up in that hammock and sat there at that window. Whoa. You know, they could just tell they were really like us Riley.
Well, let's end with, do you have a favorite song that comes to mind when you think about music or what you and your dad did? A song?
A song?
Song?
Oh, a song.
A song.
Well, they had one that they composed about the cowboys, in the band, and they opened this music every time with that song. I can't remember now what it was.
Can't sing it for us?
No.
Nope. All right, then we'll say thank you very much for sharing your story with us today. It was a pleasure.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it.
All right.
I know I have to have you repeat, and that's shameful, but I can't help it.